Hello, everyone. I'd like to say Ave at Gorwale to the late Robert Fisk. Dr. Fisk died just a couple of days ago, but there's been so much going on with the US election that I didn't make a video about it so far. Moreover, he's been pushed off the front pages by the American election and coronavirus and all that. Mr. Fisk, sorry, Dr. Fisk, as I should say, he died at the age of 74. I'm not sure where, I think it was in the Middle East. He was a British chap born in Kent. That's a very southeastern corner of the United Kingdom. Though his family were English for centuries, they had distant Danish ancestry. And one of his books, he pointed out, means his surname is Fish in Danish. So he's best known for reporting on the Ishmaelites for decades. So his father was a veteran of the First World War, was a rather old father, and Fisk, I think, was an only child. Grew up in a solid middle-class household. His father was a patriot and could also be a racist. Fisk went to France several times as a child in the 1950s, with his father revisiting where his father had fought 40 years earlier. Fisk went to the University of Lancaster. He read history. He then became a journalist. Pretty soon he was covering the Middle East. He later, in the late 70s, early 80s, went to Trinity College Dublin, where he took a PhD. It was a thesis about the Republic of Ireland during the Second World War, when we were neutral. We weren't a republic back then. ERA, Southern Ireland, whatever you want to call us. And that was published as a mainstream book in time of war, which I have perused, well, more than perused, and it's captivating. He acquired a flawless command of Arabic through his decades in Araby, and he covered Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. And from those places, he was always local. He wasn't covering them from London, and he wasn't coming from a five-star hotel. He believed in going out into the field and getting his sources and seeing for himself, and not trusting what people would have you believe. Of course, in the days of Saddam Hussein, you had to go around with a minder to spy on you, but partly so you only saw what they wanted you to see. You only bumped into people who were going to give you whatever Saddam's line was. But Fisk said the trouble is, if you're here for a few decades, people say, oh, you've gone native, you're too sympathetic to the indigenous people. But if you don't, they say, if you're relatively new, they say, well, you're wet behind the ears, you know nothing about the region, so you can't really win. He excoriated imperialism. And in 1991, he was one of the few journalists saying, oh, this war to liberate Kuwait is really about oil, just replacing one dictatorship with another, and so on. And Norman Schwarzkopf saying, oh, I don't know why people keep bringing this up. But even Fisk obliquely acknowledged in his book, if Kuwait were not liberated, then the whole system of nation states would break down and people would get away with aggression all the time. But the trouble is they do that anyway. You see, like Russia invading and occupying some of Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia, or Armenia occupying some of Azerbaijan, or Turkey occupying some of Cyprus. There have been numerous more examples in recent decades, or Argentina invading British territory, and so on. Remember, he noticed in Kuwait, the Palestinian community were very pro-Saddam because Saddam was someone who backed them to the hilt in their struggle for liberation. Then when the Iraqis were defeated, the Palestinian community got a very hard time in seeing the Palestinian boy being beaten up and having to intervene to try and save him. He had great sympathy for the Kurds. He exposed genocide against the Kurds when that was unfashionable. It didn't really suit either the Soviet Union, who was mainly arming Iraq, the United States, other Western countries also selling arms to Iraq, or NATO countries. When Turkey is a NATO country, the Cold War was still on. I mean, there wasn't quite genocide against Kurds in Turkey, but the Turkish army, I'm sorry to say, often behaved very badly. I've read some of his epoch-making tomes, such as The Great War for Civilization, which is really a history of the Middle East and the First World War. And he talked about the Paris Peace Treaty, saying it set out the borders of modern Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, and so on, and Turkey. And what's happened in my lifetime is I watched the people who lived in those borders burn, or Northern Ireland, or Yugoslavia. Now, a lot of that's false, actually, because the partition of Ireland, in a sense, was passed in 1914. So he's lying. He should know better. Called himself a historian. And it was nothing to do with the Paris Peace Treaties. Or whilst it's true that there has been fighting in some of these countries which were formed by the First World War, there have been fighting in plenty of countries that weren't formed by the First World War. You take those countries, and they've been fighting there for centuries. So it's not really a cause and effect relationship as you'd have us believe, because he's obviously got an agenda. He wants to demonize Occidental imperialism. Not that obviously it's above criticism. Now, those Paris Peace Treaties, they also set up the borders of what's now Belgium and Denmark and France and Italy and Austria. They amended those borders, and we haven't seen fighting there constantly ever since. And there are many more examples. It's not really a cause and effect relationship. Yes, even though the Paris Peace Treaties did set up Yugoslavia, we didn't call it that initially. That's not necessarily why there was fighting there in the 90s. And it didn't set up the borders of the modern Palestine and Israel. That's not really until 1948. Anyway, so it was a post hoc ergo propter hoc formal logical fallacy. He was very anti-Zionist. Not that he said that Israel shouldn't exist, but he was constantly lambasting Israel. He was one who liked to expose hypocrisy, cant, and the misuse of language, using various euphemisms, spurious excuses for crimes against humanity, often which were funded, expedited by the United States, which the US gave diplomatic cover, and which vociferated for these atrocities in international fora such as the United Nations. So when but the Oslo Peace Accords were going on in 1993 to try and give the Palestinians a modicum of freedom, the learned Dr. Fisk said this is not going to work because they'll be given such a piss poor deal. And then he was denounced as being anti-peace, and he said this was a total twaddle. So he was someone who was fearless in calling out inanity, deceitfulness, and war crimes, as I said. But yes, maybe too soft on some of the Middle Eastern tyrants like Saddam Hussein or Bashir al-Assad in Syria, and saying, oh, they want people in the Middle East, they want some of our democracy, blah, 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 but we always go with our tanks. But, I mean, well, with these tyrannies, you weren't going to get democracy without force of arms. So he didn't square that circle. People in Iraq had risen up, Kurds, Shia Muslims, and never getting any of it. Or saying, oh, we're always accusing them of having such sectarian hatred. Well, there was a great deal of sectarian hatred in Iraq. There were tens of thousands of people who killed for sectarian reasons. I'm not saying that every Shia hated every Sunni or vice versa, or maybe even most of them, but the number of those who hated people for being the opposite denomination was very considerable, and it was severe hatred. It wasn't a mild antipathy. So he had no children. He had a flat in Beirut, where he spent most of his time. He's much admired in Arabian. When he was injured in Afghanistan, he was beaten up by a crowd who were irate because they'd been bombed by the US Air Force. He was a white, presumably Nazrani, and his life was saved by some selfless Bangladeshi paramedics. Anyway, he said, if I'd been one of those people, I would have beaten me up too. You people are not thinking straight. They're furious. They've seen their relatives blown to bits, and they want to exact vengeance. And he seems to be the face of the West, so they went for him. You see this such of insensate bigotry and violence in Western countries as well. The kind of thing that Donald Trump thrives off, expectorating hatred against the other, against brown people, appealing to xenophobia. So he didn't appear so much on television in recent years. Dr. Fisk was a lot on RT on Russia Today. He very seldom criticised the Russian government. He'd been in Afghanistan, as I said, also in the 1980s during that conflict, the internationalist war, as well as after 9/11. So he was a skeptic. He was someone with unparalleled contacts, and as recently as as early as 2002, the US was claiming Saddam Hussein had been vaporized. He said he's alive, and people said to him, "How do you know he's still alive?" He said, "I know." And they said to him on this television show, "But Robert Fisk, how do you know Saddam is alive?" And he said, "I know." And he wouldn't reveal his sources because he was obviously indirectly in contact with him. The only Western journalist to have interviewed Osama bin Laden, having gone deep into the mountain fastness of Afghanistan to have one-on-one meetings with him, where it seemed to be him that Osama bin Laden was seeking to recruit him for his organization. That's just a little bit about Robert Fisk, who died of, I'm not quite sure what of, a few days ago. How I wish I'd met him. An utterly fascinating character, intrepid, and wrote in very lucid prose. So he was someone who was not afraid of having an opinion, didn't believe in writing mere reportage. He certainly had a slant, a bias, many people would say. He will not be missed in the chancelleries of Tel Aviv and Washington, D.C. I can say that. So there you are, Robert Fisk. Rest in peace.